This may be a hot take, but I am excited for the season 2 of The Rings of Power. And here's why. I'm the Sovereign Dork, and I'm here to talk about the various nerdy things that live rent-free inside my head, because I gotta share their brain rot with someone. So today, we're gonna talk about the good, the bad, and the confusing about what we know so far. First, I think it's really important to acknowledge what the previous season did well. I have not heard any complaints about the music, and for good reason. Bear McCreary did an incredible job. The music is his own take on Middle-earth, but it still gives a nod to Howard Shore's iconic work, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the music when we talk about season 2, but there's definitely a lot to love there, from Elrond's theme to the theme of Khazad-dûm. And I think that this season is looking like it's going to be just as good, if not better, in the musical department. I also have no complaints about the acting in the first season. I think anytime it fell a little flat was more to do with weaknesses in the writing than the abilities of the actors. And even though my thoughts on the show are net positive, I'm not above admitting that the writing was kind of uneven. When the script was tight, the actors shine. The plot between Elrond, Durin, and Disa, honestly the entire plot with Khazad-dûm, was the peak of the show. The chemistry between those three and the depiction of the arguably greatest dwarven kingdom to ever exist, the dialogue, were all very strong in that portion of the show. The continued strength of that particular plot is going to be kind of my test for season 2. As far as the plot is concerned, Adar was another strong piece of the plot. He's the perfect tragic villain, a victim of circumstance. We don't need another one in Sauron, thank you. The fact that they are exploring the sentience of orcs, which is something that Tolkien himself struggled with, makes for a really compelling conflict. Tolkien has always kind of implied that the orcs were sentient and that they were individuals in his writings, so the dual implication that they were inherently evil alongside that sentience kind of led him to feeling conflicted. So I'm really glad that we get to see that play out in Adar's character, and I'm very excited for him in season 2. On a brief side note, I thought the visuals were generally good, especially the return of practical effects with the orcs. Thank you. I just thought that the creatures and the monsters in the show, like the troll and the wolves, fell short in comparison to everything else. I also wasn't a huge fan of the design of the warg. And in another show, I might not have batted an eye, but when the rest of the visuals are that strong, any piece that falls a little short is going to stand out that much more, and I think that's what really happened with the creatures in the show. So there were 2 portrayals in the show in the first season that were almost universally disliked, but my opinion on them will largely depend on how they're depicted in season 2. The first is Galadriel. Everyone last season seemed to be very worked up about girl boss Galadriel, but I wasn't nearly as unhappy because to me it seemed pretty clear that the writers intend for Galadriel's character to be dynamic, change with the upcoming seasons, and I don't really fault them for wanting to have her character evolve over the course of the 5 seasons because, that's just more interesting for a writer. And it's very clear to me that they are familiar with the books. It isn't just that they don't know what she's like. For instance, in Unfinished Tales, it says Galadriel has the, quote, eye of a commander, which they decided to kind of take and run with, obviously because they made her a literal commander. Unfinished Tales also, on multiple occasions, refers to Galadriel as being proud, especially in her youth, and we definitely got proud Galadriel in season 1. It's just a matter of getting, the better versions of Galadriel in the coming seasons. Honestly, as long as we see her changing this season and kind of starting to move more towards, the Galadriel we know and love from the Third Age, I'll be happy, and I'm not going to be calling it retconning because I do genuinely believe this was their plan from the start. They were intentionally making her less likable. The other plot I think could go well, depending on its portrayal, is actually the plot with the Mithril. To be clear, if it's left as is, I'm not a fan. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense for Mithril to have healing properties, and the whole exchange between Gil-galad and Elrond with that apocryphal tale on the origins of Mithril just kind of felt off. However, if it is revealed to be a plot or trick by Sauron in Season 2, I'd be down. Don't know how it would be a plot or trick of his, but I'd still be down. So the first teaser trailer we see what appeared to be the initial infection of the tree in Lindon. That little goo critter makes its way up the cliffside, presumably to go for the tree. Now, if that goo critter was acting on Sauron's orders and he designed or instructed it to be repelled by Mithril, it could work. Because if the elves believe Mithril is their only salvation, this has the potential to sow discord between the elves and the dwarves, who have a good relationship at the time, and that would work in Sauron's favor, or the elves leave Middle-earth when they're told no by the dwarves, which also would work in Sauron's favor. And look, I'm not saying that this couldn't get messy plot-wise, but I'd still take the whole Mithril plot being a manipulation of Sauron over what it's looking like now. If they decide to leave the plot as is, I think it's a missed opportunity, frankly. I understand they wanted a more sympathetic reason for the elves to create their rings of power. That's perfectly fine. But I think that they could have framed it more along the lines of elves remembering how bad the first age was and not wanting a repeat. I mean, how many elven cities were razed to the ground in the first age? A lot. You've got Gondolin, you've got Doriath, you've got Sirion. So I think it would have been more effective. But I digress. We have bigger fish to fry because we have a teaser trailer and 2 official trailers that give us an idea of what to expect in Season 2. And I am all sorts of worked up in both good and bad ways. Before I talk about anything else, though, I just really want to say how delighted I am that the trailers all seem to be framed almost like a horror film. I just thought it was very appropriate. But on to the actual substance of those trailers. First, we have Anatar, baby. The second I saw Charlie Vickers in the blonde wig, all I could think was, Anatar, Anatar. I was so excited. But getting that confirmation when he says he's a sharer of gifts is very nice. And I'm personally ready to see the manipulative Sauron in his look what you made me do phase, because I don't really care for a sympathetic portrayal of Sauron. I'm fine with most villains doing that, but he's a big bad who I would prefer just be evil for the sake of being evil. I like having a few of those around. So, based on what we've seen in the trailers, we're going to get a lot of him and Celebrimbor this season, which is great. It's exactly what we all want. That was kind of one of my expectations after we didn't get Anatar in Season 1. But Anatar doesn't just mean that whole conflict involving Celebrimbor, though. I'm really ready to see him try to enter Lindon, only for Gil-galad to say, no, my friend Elrond doesn't like you. You're not welcome here. Don't let the door hit you on the ass on the way out. Very excited for that. And if I don't get that, I'm going to be very sad. Speaking of Elrond, am I the only one who wants more allusions to his foresight in this season? Obviously, keep it vague and mysterious, the way it should be. But Elrond was honestly a highlight of last season. I'll take pretty much anything to do with him in this one. And I just find the whole idea of foresight very interesting. I want more allusions to it. They talked about it very briefly in like the first episode between Gil-galad and Elrond, but didn't really touch on it much after that. So I want more of that. Thank you. One item that the show is going to have to touch on this season is the origin of the Line of Durin's Ring of Power. In the books, they'd kind of always maintained that Sauron was not the one to give them the ring. So I really do like the idea of Celebrimbor giving the dwarves their ring out of his own goodwill towards them. And considering it looks like we're getting Narvi in the show, I'm wondering how he's going to fit in with that. given how much screen time is probably going to be shared by Celebrimbor and Anatar. I'm not sure how the friendship between Celebrimbor and Narvi could be depicted, but I'm rooting for it. We're all rooting for it. I want to see them build the Doors of Durin together. And I actually think it would be interesting for Narvi to be the first one who notices something is up with his Celebrim bestie, as Sauron is manipulating Celebrimbor. The next item we're getting was one that I was initially very excited about, but now is more of a mixed bag for me. On one hand, we're getting Rune in this adaptation, which is so rad. Because Rune hasn't been depicted on screen before, that gives the creators of the show a lot of freedom. One difficulty they face frequently, and I don't envy them, is trying to depict places and characters who we've seen before. They're trying to create their own story, their own spin on things, while still showing reverence for material that's come before. With the Peter Jackson films, it's a tall order. And I'm not going to stand here and say they always get it right. For instance, I was not a huge fan of Sauron using Galadriel's speech from the Fellowship of the Ring while speaking with her, and there's just a lot of places where they'll borrow dialogue from the Peter Jackson films where it feels a little out of place. On the other hand, there are other aspects where they've really thrived with this. I think their depiction of the dwarves was one of their stronger suits. Something I didn't really care for with the Peter Jackson adaptations was the fact that the dwarves were so often used for humor, typically body humor. And in the Rings of Power, the only time body humor is really used is when Durin is using it strategically, either to make a point or get what he wants. It's not his default. It's him intentionally being rude because he's mad at someone. With Rune, they have this great opportunity, and while I'm excited about it, there are facets of that plot which have been revealed I'm not thrilled about, including Tom Bombadil in the story, which was a choice. I personally could have lived without him in the show, and I know that's a very unpopular opinion, but there it is. I also wanted to see runic dwarves in the show. Oh, that would have been so cool, since we know there are dwarves in Rune. And I thought that was something that could be really fun, interesting, and again, give kind of a little more freedom to the creators. But instead, it looks like we're getting Stoors. And they're important enough to get their own song in the soundtrack. It's a great song, don't get me wrong. It's a beautiful song. But I don't like the fact that they're important enough to get their own song in the soundtrack. Look, I know the writers seem to think that you can't have a show about Middle-earth without hobbits, so if they want to have Nori and Poppy, I'm fine with that. But could they cool it with the proto-hobbits? I'd hoped we'd pass that point, but apparently not. As long as they keep the Stoors to a minimum and the wizards to a maximum in Rune, I'll be happy. Having listened to the soundtrack, which released a few days ago, honestly, the music from Rune was some of my favorites on there. The songs from Rune have a very different vibe, and I am here for it. And they're just a little off-kilter in the best way possible. I'm just really stoked about the soundtrack in general. For instance, one thing we know we're getting is the Barrow Wights. As far as, the fact that they're supposed to be from the Third Age or whatever, I'm just a gal who's happy to be getting Barrow Wights. And who's to say that Sauron didn't teach the Witch King of Angmar how to do that stuff? So, necromancy, Barrow Wights, that's all well within Sauron's abilities. So, I'm not going to complain if I'm getting some pretty badass looking Barrow Wights. And if you listen to the soundtrack, something that made my little heart sing was the Barrow Wights song, because you hear these whispers in it, and if you listen closely, they are whispering the poems that the Barrow Wights speak in the Fellowship of the Ring. So, once again, another point for Bear McCreary. The guy has definitely earned his titles and his awards. His song for Shelob is also incredible. It literally sounds like a bunch of little legs making their way along, and it is creepy. It makes my skin crawl because I hate spiders so much. As excited as I am that the iconic Shelob is going to be in the show, I am at the same time terrified. And I haven't even seen her horrible face yet, so we'll see how well I hold up. Moving away from the music a little bit, something we're getting which I had not anticipated this season is the Entwives. All I can say about that is I'm stoked to see them depicted and less stoked to see what happens to them because I am emotionally unprepared for that weep fest. I'm also excited to see Arendir return, even if it looks like Bronwyn isn't. My guess is that the season is probably going to be Arendir pulling around Theo and Isildur on proverbial child leashes to keep the two of them from inevitably causing too much trouble. But in all seriousness, I don't think we got enough of Arendir and Theo last season, and, as sad as I am to see Bronwyn out of the picture, her no longer being in the picture is going to facilitate more interaction between Arendir and Theo, and I think that that's not a bad direction for the show to go in. But speaking of emotional weep fests, we're also getting the Siege of Eregion. It's supposed to be a long one over several episodes, and I of course have perfectly normal and reasonable feelings about Gil-galad's battle braid. But on a more serious note, I am curious to see how Adar is going to play into that, since he clearly has no love for Sauron. But I also don't trust him not to betray Galadriel. The conflict definitely gives the opportunity for the escalation of the rift between Durin the Third and Durin the Fourth. If the father doesn't think the dwarves should involve themselves in the fate of the elves, which would be kind of within what we've established as a character for him, just because to me it seemed like Durin the Third encapsulated all of the negative traits that are typically associated with dwarves. Not caring about other races, kind of holding himself in the mountain, some of that suspicion. Meanwhile, Durin the Fourth encapsulates all of the best traits that we see in the dwarves. Fiercely brave, loves his friends, not afraid to speak his mind, which could be kind of a double-edged sword. But I kind of liked that dichotomy between the two, and I'm hoping we're going to see a little more of it. As far as the actual Siege of Eregion, I'm fairly certain that battle is going to serve as the end of the season. Leaving off on a darker note would be appropriate, I think, and showing the loss of Eregion as Elrond rides towards Rivendell. I don't know, it just feels right to me, so I'm thinking that's probably what we're going to see for the end of the season. I know we see a little bit of the Balrog in some of those teasers, but I don't think we're going to be getting it this season for a couple reasons. One, it just doesn't seem to fit with the overall narrative. We've already got enough going on with Anatar and Celebrimbor and the rings and everything to do with that piece of the plot. I think if you added the Balrog on top of all of that, the season would just get way too busy. And I don't know, it just doesn't seem right timing-wise. That feels more like something that would be in the later seasons if they include it at all, rather than just being, a little wink-wink, nod-nod to what we all know is going to happen in the Third Age. As far as what we're not likely to see in this season, but I want, with a capital W, is the whole plot with Sauron and Numenor. Don't get me wrong, I think we're going to have plenty to fill the Numenor plotline this season. You've got the power struggle between the newly blinded Miriel and Pharazôn, an impending conflict between Elendil and Eärien, inevitable as he's coming home without Isildur, and a deeper look into the Kingsmen versus the Faithful factions. I'm really excited to see where they go there. There was like a little scene in one of the trailers where it looked like they were rounding up a bunch of old people, and I'm not sure exactly what's going on there. It could have been them rounding up the Faithful, but who's to say? Something that I thought was interesting, and I could be totally off base here, but am I the only one who saw the scene with Pharazôn drawing his sword with that eagle and thought it kind of looked like he was drawing the sword on the eagle. I just thought that bird looked nervous. Maybe it's just me. Anyway, I'm not bummed if we don't get Sauron and Numenor this season, but I think it would be great to have that in season 3, as well as a stronger connection between the Numenorians and the elves, a la Elrond. I get a ridiculous amount of joy imagining Elrond going to Numenor, and then every Numenorian looks at him, then looks at a picture of Elros, then looks back at Elrond, as they kind of like connect the dots and say, hey, he looks just like our first king if you took away the beard. Do I think that's going to happen? Probably not, but I can still get a ridiculous amount of joy out of imagining it if I so desire. I'd also really like to get a better look at other elven lands in season 2, but I'd settle for seeing them in season 3. As great as it has been to see Lindon and Eregion, I really would love to see Greenwood and Lorinind. I mean, you can't have the Last Alliance without Greenwood and Lorinind, which will later be known as Lothlorien. And if the showrunners want Orifer and Amdir's deaths in the final siege against Mordor to have any kind of real impact, they're going to need to take the time to make us care about those characters first. And by us, I mean people who are not already over the top emotionally invested like I am in the two characters. I also don't think I'm going to get this, but I would love for Thranduil to be a member of Elrond's little Elves Assemble team that we've seen a couple times in the trailers. Not a need, but a want. I also really want to get Celeborn and Celebrian in the show. First of all, I want to know what Valar, Forsaken, or Cole they've put poor Celeborn in. We might get him this season since he was at least mentioned last season, but that still leaves us wondering about Celebrian. I could honestly probably make a whole episode about her, and I probably will. But she's a potentially strong and canonical female character who we know enough about to give us kind of a vague outline, but still gives the creators of the show a little leeway as far as how they choose to depict her. So I think it'd be kind of a mistake not to take advantage of that. I'll be honest, I also just really want to see the eloquent, silver-tongued Elrond reduced to a bumbling, stuttering mess who can't get a sentence out and is teased mercilessly by Durin and Disa. Is that too much to ask for? I don't think so. Furthermore, I know that movies and TV like to have romantic plots in them, and here is a prepackaged one ready for the taking. I have my opinions about the romantic subplot in the Hobbit movies, which is the Hobbit has no love triangle. The Hobbit needs no love triangle. But when the romance is canonical, I will eat that up. I'd still prefer if it wasn't a love triangle, thank you. It's overdone, and I will be thoroughly entertained enough with just watching Elrond pine for a season. Plot-wise, having both Celeborn and Celebrian in the show gives this show an opportunity in how they depict Galadriel. If, as the show has hinted, Galadriel became the way she is in season 1 due to grief, it makes her more sympathetic and gives more opportunity to explore kind of that process for her, how she went from being the lady dancing in the flowers when Celeborn first saw her to, you know, the maniac who threatens Elendil with a knife and threatens monarchs in other countries and pisses off the monarch in her own country and, you know, etc., etc. I also really like the idea of Celeborn kind of, and Celebrian, should we get her in the show, bringing Galadriel back from this spiral that she seems to be on. I just want her two nerds to bring her back from the brink. On the whole, I'm very excited for the second season, and I think there's a lot of potential there, even if that is an unpopular opinion. I am recording this the night before the premiere, and you'd best bet that I am going to be watching those 3 episodes when they premiere and probably sharing all the brain rot I have on those as well. I have been the Sovereign Dork, and thank you for dorking out with me.